episode of the C-Suite Edge. I'm your host, John Light, president and founder of Sabretooth Recruiting, and today I'm really lucky. I have never spoken with anyone in the space that Ryan Baird at Baird Augustine occupies as a neo-investment bank. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I got to ask, first off, and by way of introduction to our audience and anyone who listens, first off, tell us a little bit, maybe a 90-second rundown of you, but also kind of bring us up to speed on what does a neo-investment bank do?
Sure. So I'm actually third generation Silicon Valley. My grandfather worked for Lockheed before Martin, and both my parents worked for Hewlett Packard their entire careers. So I have that HP way ingrained in myself. And my first job out of college, I was working with Morgan Stanley right here on Sand Hill Road, dealing with their top clients with $50 million of investable assets or greater. And I pretty much stayed in the institutional investing space my entire career. Had a stint in hedge funds. I was doing corporate development for a startup for a while. I did global venture for a number of years, and then I ran my own startup that we raised over $35 million for. And then it was after those experiences that we decided to start Baird Augustine. And it was really because I'd met a number of family offices when I was doing global venture, and they had asked for introductions to other investment banks, and I would make those introductions. And I was really surprised that the feedback that we got was that they were treated very transactionally. And that hit me pretty strongly because Silicon Valley is famous for relationship-based businesses. Hewlett Packard was a relationship-based business. Steve Jobs interned at Hewlett Packard. Wozniak worked at Hewlett Packard. Apple copied Hewlett Packard's culture. Apple was very much a relationship-based culture when it first started. However, as these Silicon Valley companies have gotten bigger, we've seen the average tenure, or the time that people work at these companies, go from over 10 years to now being under 2 years. In fact, Tesla and NVIDIA are the only two Mag 7 companies that have an average tenure of over 2 years. So we've seen kind of these large corporations become more transactional over time. And I think that's the exact same thing that's happened at a lot of these investment banks. They go public, they have to have quarterly earnings. So, they end up treating people like, you got to pay us now, or we got to focus on someone who is going to be paying us right now. Yeah. So we really started Baird Augustine to treat these family offices the way they should be treated, and really focus on the relationship. If they don't have any business to do with us right now, that's completely fine. The phone is open, and we're happy to talk to them. And when they do need us, we'll be here for them. And I'm very excited about what we've done in the last couple of years. We've gotten an award from the state of California for our investment banking decorum and some of the innovative approaches that we've done in private placements. We're helping 33 family offices that are in our network that we work with pretty regularly. We have hundreds of family offices that have attended our events. And, we're really just focusing on helping them deploy capital across the alternative asset class space, industry agnostic, geo agnostic. However, there does tend to be a preference for US and Silicon Valley. In addition to the investment bank, we also run Focus on Risk, which is an investment group that I started back in 2009. And what makes us unique is that we host events for investors. I think if you go to a lot of events in Silicon Valley, you would realize that these are events for founders. And I do think that there is a place, there needs to be a place for events for founders. It's extremely important. They need a place that they can practice their pitches. They need a place where they can meet people in Silicon Valley, talk to angel investors, etc. However, when we were going to investor events back in 2009 and we were looking for investments, we would hear from maybe 50 founders in one night, and all of them were uninvestable. And instead of continuing to go to these events, we started hosting our own events where we would only invite investors. We wouldn't invite any founders. However, we would let one of the investors showcase one of their portfolio companies. So we would get to hear the opportunity from the founder, but more importantly, we got to hear from the investor about why now, why this team, why are you spending time here, why are you investing here when there's literally millions of opportunities to deploy your capital. And we found that by calling it Focus on Risk, by really focusing on the actual problems that are happening in the business and trying to remove those layers of risk, these events got extremely popular, and we've done them all over the country, all over the world, hundreds of them now. We've done them in 19 countries. And the big lesson from doing them all over the world is that I was wrong. Originally, I thought Silicon Valley was going to be all over the world and we were going to start seeing unicorns pop up in all of these major metropolitan areas. However, when I started investing globally, I realized pretty quickly that the team slide in Silicon Valley is so much better than these other geos. And really, honestly, all of these major metropolitan areas, they're all building the same kind of startups. So the startups that are in Silicon Valley, they have, I don't know, a decade worth of experience at Apple, Uber, or one of these major companies. They have the financial resources and the network to actually get a startup off the ground and get it running. Where I feel like a lot of these teams and other geos, unless they just absolutely have a rock star team, it's going to be very hard for them to compete.
When you say other geos, are you speaking specifically about global, or are you including places? Austin, Texas has become a place where there's a lot of tech involvement. A lot of people from Silicon Valley have gone there. New York City, for example, another one. So I'm curious, when you're saying geos, is it you thinking domestically, or are you thinking more broadly, strictly on a global basis, like comparing Silicon Valley to Manila or Delhi or Frankfurt or wherever you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, Silicon Valley's the mecca, so really anywhere you compare it to, it's just on a completely different playing field. The amount of capital raised, the amount of wealth that's here to deploy into startups is really just unmatched. And, if you're investing in like an Austin or a New York or something like that, you have to ask yourself the question, does this team really have what it takes to raise the next round to get to the next level of investor? And, I think you can see some companies get to a Series A, but to actually break out and get to that Series B, we just don't see it very often in other geos. I
So tell
would
me
love to
this.
see it. I'm rooting for other geos. It's
Well,
just
yeah, I mean,
unfair advantage by being in Silicon Valley.
well, and there's tech, and then there's other tech, like industrial tech too, that you may not see in Silicon Valley, and there could be some overlap. One of the biggest tech events that I've ever been around is in Houston, and it's the Offshore Technology Conference. And people don't realize that when you start talking about offshore production, construction, everything goes, the technology involved is mind-boggling. But none of it is ever going to be B2C. It's always going to be B2B, and it's always going to be hundreds of millions, if not tens of billions of dollars on one project. But the technology, like I said, is mind-boggling, and I'm sure Silicon Valley has that feeling, but in a different respect, right? Because you've got so many different aspects that technology is applied to, and breakthroughs, the big companies, the HPs that you mentioned, and so on. I'm curious to know, because you just covered a tremendous amount of territory. And number one, I'm grateful for it. There's a lot of great content in there. but if you were going to break things down, especially in the context of Baird Augustine, what's the biggest problem you solve in that context you just laid out? What's the one thing that you guys can hit out of the park better than anyone else?
Yeah, I think the main thing for us is we find founders that want to focus on building their business. They don't want to have to
Okay.
worry about all the corporate development. And oftentimes, startups just can't afford a corp dev team. And
Yeah.
then the founders end up doing all the fundraising, they're doing all these interviews to try to find board members and advisors where they could just pay us a monthly retainer. We can come in, understand their business objectives, the biggest risks to their business, and we just spend all of our time working on removing those layers of risk. And that could be getting earned media, it could be hiring a C-level executive, it could be getting a new board member, it could be just running investor relations and introducing them to investors, but also taking calls with prospective investors that we don't know if they're actually interested yet. It feels like it's a big waste of time for the co-founder to be doing that when they can just outsource it to us. So we like to find founders that have already done it. So they've already raised, significant capital in the past. They know how hard it is. They've already sold their company for $100 million plus. Now they have their next big idea. That's the perfect founder for us to get involved with because they understand how much time it takes and they realize that it's better to just outsource it to us versus having them do all of the outreach and meetings themselves.
Interesting. Yeah, because that is a de facto barrier to growth for a lot of founders, right? Because you have a founder or a group of founders who have very specific domain knowledge, and they can come in and solve a really relevant problem that, from an economics perspective or an efficiencies perspective, deserves the treatment they can give it. But in general terms, none of them have ever had to go through fundraising, and none of them have ever had to go through all the presentations, which, there's a couple of full-time jobs in there, right, that require certain skills, certain expertise. And some people, I think, probably do it naturally, because I know if you're sitting in the investor chair, you want to walk away feeling confident that you've got the right founder in place that you're going to put money behind and your time behind. And some people can naturally project and communicate that. Some people struggle with it. Either way you look at it, it's a pretty big learning curve for someone who's brand new.
Yeah. And I think founders often get the whole pitching part wrong. I think they think that they're only pitching for money all the time. And that is a big part of it, don't get me wrong, but they're also just showing that they could pitch. And that's an important piece because if you're going to invest in a company for the next 10 plus years, you want to make sure that they could hire key people and get them to leave great paying jobs to come to their startup for a bunch of equity. You want to make sure that they can raise from the investor after you, right? Maybe you really like the guy, but he can't raise capital. How are they going to get to the next level? People looking at pitching, can this person get earned media, or are they going to have to hire a PR team and pay for media? So the pitch is actually extremely important, and I think some founders can just spend a few weeks and work on their speaking, and they would realize that it helps them in more ways than one.
Yeah, funny enough, coming from the talent acquisition space where I spend the bulk of my time, I counsel candidates all the time on a very specific 4-part interview framework. And one of the main components is getting them to do some homework to help make their communication not just more effective and efficient, but more impactful. Because you get somebody goes up and does a pitch and they meander at all, they're going to lose their audience. And, it's interesting to me how few people actually think that they should practice a pitch or practice an answer or practice, how they're going to come across before the moment. And they get in there and they're OTJing it and it's a train wreck. And it's not because they don't have a great idea, right? But it's because they didn't prepare.
Yeah,
So
you got to practice your pitch. I always tell people they should record it. They should listen to themselves. They should be critical. If you're a startup founder, you're going to be telling thousands of people about your business. So it's good to have it just, completely nailed and all worked out so that you can maximize your time when you're speaking to people.
Yeah, well, and maximize your impact. At the end of the day, I think, a solution, an idea that's going from amorphous to being something more solidified, you got to be able to catch attention with it. It's got to resonate with people. We talk people talk all the time about product market fit. Product market fit can be borne out by numbers, but there's a lot of science with it. There's also a bit of art, right? That's one thing Jobs was great at, is absorbing and understanding what the consumer wanted and then going to that. And I think people tend to lose sight of it, especially if they become, like you mentioned earlier, some of these larger companies become so transactional, and everyone and every skill and every idea is commoditized. And I think that's a qualitative mistake overall, because it also sounds to me, unless I'm missing my guess, a big chunk of what you guys do is bringing some of that qualitative aspect back. Kind of the balance between the science and the art, and you're bringing some of the art back, not neglecting the science, not running away from the numbers and the KPIs and everything that drive it, but getting in there and making those connections. You know, when you drop that statistic, there's only a couple of companies in Silicon Valley that have an average tenure of more than 2 years. That's stunning to me. I mean, the amount of value they let walk out the door. I might need a couple days to absorb that, frankly, because I hadn't heard that before. That's incredible.
Yeah, and it's because these companies have become super large and, you know, people graduate college and they want to get a job at a publicly traded company, and instead of looking at it as a career, they just look at it as a stepping stone to go start their own startup, or they play the job game and try to switch jobs every couple of years to get paid more. And you know, when you've grown your company to be so large, it's just hard to maintain that culture of, you know, remembering everyone's wife's name and their kids' birthdays and all the things that you can easily do with a smaller organization.
Yeah, man, that's and that one really hits home. Like I said, I'm gonna have to process it a little bit. Hey, Ryan, if someone wants to get in touch with you and talk more about Baird Augustine and what you deliver in the market, what's the best way for folks to find you?
Yeah, they can come to our website, bairdAugustine.com. We're also all active on pretty much all social media channels, either under Focus on Risk or Ryan Baird. They should be able to find us. We're pretty easy to find.
Well, hey, that's the best way to be when you're looking for folks. So, man, I'm indebted for you to be here. Some of the stuff that you brought up really resonates, and I want to make sure that at some point in the future, you and I have a chance to reconnect and cut another one of these. I think we could dive into some stuff in more detail.
I would love that. That'd be great.
Super. Ryan, thanks so much for joining me.
Awesome. Thanks, John.